My phone's on silent. How about yours? Welcome, everyone, and good evening. My name's Alice Grundy. I'm Managing Editor of Australia Institute Press, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you here this evening to unceded Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. I'd like to pay my respects to the Aboriginal people who have cared for this land for many, many millennia. Thank you for coming along this evening. I know it's pretty cold out there and it looks like it might rain, but you're here for an excellent evening. The Australia Institute is proud to be one of the country's most influential think tanks, and we're also pretty well trusted as well. We're producing high impact research that matters. And the only way that that's possible is thanks to donations from people like you. My excellent colleague Hannah down the back is collecting donations this evening. All you have to do is scan your bank card. So, our special guest this evening is Richard Dennis, Executive Director of the Australia Institute. In a crowd like this in Canberra, he doesn't really need an introduction, but I'm going to give one anyway. You'll know him as an economist. He's the author of 6 books, including Curing Affluenza, Dead Right, How Neoliberalism Ate Itself and What Comes Next, and Big, The Role of the State in the Modern Economy. He's formerly a regular columnist for the Australian Financial Review and The Guardian, and he spent the last 20 years moving between policy roles in academia, federal politics, and think tanks. Please welcome Richard Dennis. So we're here to talk about Dead Centre, how political pragmatism is killing us. This is the second in our Vantage Point essay series, and I'm delighted that this was the second Vantage Point essay. It's come at the perfect time. We have a new parliament who's just started sitting up at Parliament House, and now is the time to talk about the future that we want for Australia. But before we get to the future, let's talk a little bit about the past, where we've come from. This is a country where some people are quite proud to declare themselves as centrist or to talk about the sensible centre. What is centrism?
Thanks. Oh, is that on? Got a little green light on it. Yeah. How's that? That's a bit better. Do you want to see if we can get that one working? So what is centrism? Obviously, it means different things to different people. I talk about it in 2 different ways in the book. One way, I think the sort of most intuitive way that certainly the Australian media thinks about pragmatism, thinks about centrism, is that it's the sort of pragmatic focus on issues that sit between the 2 extremes of the Labor Party and the coalition. Right, so the sort of parameters of what we as a nation can do is kind of set by the major parties. It's not to say you can't float an idea that isn't sort of plausibly going to be supported by either the current government or whoever the opposition is, but that kind of idea of centrism sort of really dominates so much of our thinking. So, to give you an example of how much that changes over time and how sort of meaningless centrism is as some form of goal or, as a sort of landmark against which we can navigate. If you go all the way back to 2007, John Howard supported a carbon price. Kevin Rudd supported a carbon price. In 2007, a carbon price, there was bipartisan consensus for it. So nearly all of the world's economists, both of the major political parties in Australia, and a majority of the population thought a carbon price was a good idea in 2007. But today, if I said, hey, you're having a whole productivity roundtable, pretty much every economist in the world thinks carbon tax is a good idea. Why aren't you talking about that? Oh, that's not very pragmatic, Richard. That's not very. We're trying to get things done here. Keep your extreme ideas away from the big kids conversation. So it doesn't make any sense to think that 2 political parties could kind of capture the breadth of all the ideas that might be worth talking about in a democracy with 25 million people. But once you realise that the landmarks of where the Labor Party is today, where the coalition is today, keep changing all the time, the idea of wanting to be in the centre, wanting to be in the middle of that, I actually, I called the essay "Dead Centre." I just don't think it's very fertile ground. So I think a key way of thinking about centrism is between the major parties, letting them effectively set the Overton window. One other kind of quick way of thinking about centrism, some people's version of centrism, is that evidence-based policy is very centrist, right? We just want to look at the evidence. Just want to look at the evidence. Just want to collect all the evidence. Well, evidence is often extreme. Evidence is often quite radical, and very often in Australian political debate, if it's I don't know if that's my mic, but if the two major parties are here, the evidence is often way over here. And I think a lot of voters and a lot of journalists kind of believe that centrism and evidence-based policy are overlapping concepts. But it's quite clear that going along with the evidence is often quite a radical thing to do. Now, obviously, that's the case with climate policy in Australia, where both major parties support fossil fuel subsidies, both major parties support approving new gas and coal mines, both major parties think subsidising the enormous utes dominating our roads is a good way to reduce emissions. There's no evidence to support any of those things, but the idea that between Labor and Liberal is where the evidence is, and then we just kind of need to tinker at the edges. I think that's such a stupid idea. I wrote a book about it.
So you mentioned the political parties, but also the journalists. So if we're thinking about what's determining the frame of the debate in Australia, journalists play a pretty large part. What's their approach to centrism?
Look, I think every journalist will say, I'm different, and that's okay. They probably all are. But when we talk about journalism collectively, I'm talking about, the newspapers that people used to read, the ABC that people used to listen to, the people in the so-called mainstream media, which has a very small audience now. It's not very mainstream, according to the readership numbers for the Australian or the listenership numbers even for the ABC. So we still think of the media, the old media, which I'm glad exists. I hope it doesn't die too fast, but we still think of it as having this sort of dominating influence on the Australian kind of public debate, but almost no one reads it. Almost no one's watching it. So the journalists collectively in Australia, I think, fall into this centrism trap, not because they necessarily agree with, what the government's saying or what the opposition's saying, but they've been trained, literally trained, to filter what's news. Like literally, like a newspaper is full of news. The 6 p.m. news is the report of news. Journalists have tests. Editors have tests. Is this news? Is this news? And in Australia, the kind of dominant test of is this news when it comes to democracy is, did the Prime Minister say a thing? Did the opposition leader say a thing? If yes, news. No, I'm not kidding, right? Prime Minister today said this. All right, maybe that's part of the news. Opposition leader said this. Not quite sure why that's news, but a whole bunch of interesting, important things that people care about can't get discussed in newspapers or on the news. You might all be interested in gambling reform. You might all be interested in truth in political advertising laws. You might all be interested in gun law reform. You might all be interested in ending native forest logging. But if I ring a journalist and say, I want to talk about any of those things, they'll say, oh, do you think the government's going to move on that? I say, probably not. Oh, well, it's not news then. So we are prevented from having a conversation in our democracy when we let the media mediate what's news and what's not. And once the major parties figured out that if they jointly agree to not talk about something, the media won't talk about it, the major parties got better and better at just taking things off our agenda. and the media have facilitated that. Unemployment benefits in Australia are shamefully low. Fact. The unemployment benefits in Australia are way below the poverty line. Fact. Most Australians think that's bad. Fact. Can you get the media to report it? No. Why not? Or do you think the government's going to move on it? Right. So we apply this political pragmatism filter that, anything where there might be a fight between the parties, that might be news, but the rest, not going to talk about it. And I think that's why a lot of people are not only not listening or consuming that version of news so much anymore, I think it's no coincidence that at the same time the vote for the major parties is declining. Not because they're evil, not because they're stupid, not because they're hopeless, but because both the major parties and the media are silent on so many issues that people care about.
There's only one graph in this book. It's on page 37 for anyone who has one in your lap already. If you don't, Hannah can help you out down the back. But what does the one graph in the book tell us?
I said to Alice, can I just please have one graph? Just one. I know it's supposed to be an essay. Look, the one graph shows us something really important, and that is that Labor just won a record number of seats, a record high number of seats, off a near record low primary vote. Now, this does not make them an illegitimate government. This does not mean they can't govern. It's just a fact that one of the smallest Labor votes in history just delivered one of the largest number of Labor seats in Parliament. And the way I think about that is if you look up on a hill that's had a landslide, the landslide is very wide, it's just not very deep. There's just not a lot of mud on the hill. Okay, so a lot of land slipped, a lot of seats changed hands. But if you actually go and look at the primary votes, you look at how the preference flowed, you see that in seats like Canberra, in seats like Bean here in Canberra, one of the so-called safest seats in the country is now one of the most marginal. Does that seat that went from a 14% margin to a 0.5% margin, does that count in Labor's landslide? Yes, because they held the seat. All right. Same in Fremantle, one of the safest Labor seats before the election. Fremantle's now one of the most marginal. So again, Labor's won a big majority. There's the Liberals have got one of their worst performances ever. It means that I think there's no chance that the Liberals or the coalition, whether they're still in coalition next time or not, they're not going to win the next election. So this is exciting. Why should Labor spend 3 years going, we better be cautious or we might lose? We better be cautious or we might lose. Now, it's up to them if they do, right? That's on them. But for most of my adult life, I've been told Labor better be cautious or you'll get the Liberals and the Liberals will be worse. And they've used that to scare people into saying, don't ask me to be ambitious or I'll bite you on the arse. You ask me to do more, you'll get less. Well, actually, they've lost that threat now, haven't they? The question is, what do they want to do? And, Whitlam was only in for 3 years. We're talking about him 50 years later. The idea that you have to be in for 9 years to get stuff done, there's no evidence to support that at all. So big win in the number of seats, very low primary vote. Bill Shorten, I think, got a higher vote in 2019 than Albo got in 2025. All right. So it's not like people embraced Labor as, keep up the great work, don't change a thing. But people flooded away from the Libs and went to the government, went to independents, went to minor parties. Big majority, but thin support for it.
I mentioned in my introduction that you've moved between politics and academia and think tanks, and I think that's one of the things that sets this essay apart from other works talking about politics. One of the stories that's my favourite from the essay is when you talk about a bluff bill. So we're talking about the performance of politics and how politics actually works. Can you tell that story?
Yeah, sure. There's an anecdote in here from the olden days. Anyone here remember the Australian Democrats? All right. Well, I was Natasha Stott-Despoyer's chief of staff, so that was all my fault. Okay. No one else ever took responsibility, so it must have been me. Anyway, so back when I was Natasha Stott-Despoyer's chief of staff, back when the Democrats were in balance of power in the Senate, I had lots of interesting meetings with Howard government ministers and Howard himself at the time. And I tell, I think, a fun story in here that I haven't told before I wrote the essay, but I think enough time's passed. I don't name names. So I had a late night meeting in my office with a Howard government minister who came to give me a draft bill, a piece of legislation. And he said, Richard, here's our draft bill. We've been talking about it publicly. It's coming. I think you're going to hate this bill. I don't think your party's ever going to support this bill. But a clever man like you might introduce amendments that look like this, and this, and this. He handed me the amendments that he or his office had written to his own bill. This is really important. And what scares me is how many journalists have said to me, oh, I love that anecdote. I never heard anything like it. Because this is what working in Parliament House is all about. All right? It's the optics of politics. Boxers stepping into a ring to have a fight have negotiated the fight before they have the fight. They haven't agreed who's going to win, but they know how many rounds there'll be, how long the rounds will be, don't punch me in the nuts, right? All sorts of rules for fights. If you don't think politicians have rules for their own fights and that they don't sit down and discuss the rules before the fight, you're mad. Or you've been misled by a press gallery that's never told you this. So here we are, sitting late night meeting. Here's my bill. Here's the amendments. And I laughed and said, well, I'm not sure the Democrats are going to support this. He said, oh, I'm sure they're not. But, amendments like this, we can drag this out for months, Richard. Why wouldn't they want to drag it out for months? But what you probably don't perhaps even get yet in this story is, why would they do this? Why would they be amending their own bill? And the answer is because they wanted to look like they were trying. They wanted to look like they were trying to solve a problem. They wanted to look like they were ambitious. But they knew that if the bill as drafted passed, it had caused them all sorts of political problems. So why not just draft a bill that will never get through the Senate? Go to other senators or not. You don't actually have to have the polite chat. But why not just draft a bill that will never get through the Senate? Tell your side, oh, we're trying, we're doing it, look at us, big reform, bold. And then you go to the other people and you go, don't worry, it'll never get through the Senate. Why wouldn't you shout loudly that you're trying? Well, whisper to other constituents, don't worry about it, this is just a bit of kabuki play. So, I call those bills bluff bills. They're not designed to pass. They're designed to project intent. They're designed to make it look like there's activity where there's none. And if that sounds like, ancient history, remember what happened in the last parliament when Tanya Plibersek and Sarah Hanson-Young successfully negotiated an EPA, an Environmental Protection Authority? Does anyone remember what happened after they successfully negotiated one? Albo came in over the top. Because Tanya was never meant to solve the problem. You weren't supposed to actually negotiate a solution, Tanya. What are you doing? The point of the EPA was to try and get it through. The point of the EPA was to say, look, we want one, but the Greens, they're extreme, they want too much. And the Liberals, they don't want enough. And us, Labor government, have got the balance right. And everyone else is making the perfect the enemy of the good. But of course, Tanya, who might have, had some strong feelings, maybe undermined her own government by successfully negotiating something that was never meant to be successfully negotiated. But even then, when Albo came in over the top, you don't remember that the Prime Minister came in over the top. What do you remember happened? Who stopped it? WA. Because everyone knows the West Australian Premier is in charge of the Commonwealth Parliament. That's obvious, isn't it? So even when the Prime Minister stepped in to say, it was a bluff bill, what the fuck are you doing? He blamed the nasty mining companies and he blamed that West Australian Premier. Right, so yeah, most people think they're cynical about politics. My advice to you is you're probably not cynical enough. And next time you hear a government say, I've drafted this legislation, it's perfect, just as it is. And if the Senate won't pass it, that's the Senate that's being obstructionist. That's not how John Howard got the GST through. That's not how John Howard got Telstra privatised. That's not how Julia Gillard got so much legislation through. But it's easy when the media let you off to play this silly centrism game and literally anticipate how your opponents will behave, bank on them trying to stop you, and then blame them for you not getting anything done. That's maybe why people think they need 9 years to change the country.
So no new gas and coal is a slogan, not a policy. It's clearly extreme, and extreme things can't get through the parliament. How is it that we can actually see some change on climate if it's just extremism that calls for serious action?
Yeah, look, good question. I guess the problem, there's multiple problems here. The main one is that at the moment, and pressure works, so I'm talking about what people say they believe today, not what we can make them believe in the years ahead. But, according to Labor today, building new gas and coal mines is an important part of tackling climate change. Now, because the Liberals agree with that, and because the media can't find a gap between them and there's nothing to report about that, we live in a country that's opening new gas and coal mines and being told we're tackling climate change. Now, that's just absurd. And at the moment, it's extreme to suggest that maybe there'll be a last gas mine approved. Maybe there'll be a last coal mine approved. It's extreme to ask the government when they think that might be. Right? If you listen to the climate minister, to even be asked this question is an insulting distraction from the important work of telling us about the number of solar panels that got installed or something else. So is it extreme to push for things that both major parties currently don't feel like doing? Well, I don't think so, because, once upon a time we did whaling. And was it extreme to suggest that the solution to whaling was to end whaling? Once upon a time, we mined asbestos. Is it extreme to suggest that we needed to stop mining asbestos? Did we ask the asbestos industry, what asbestos reduction target? You laugh, right? The climate scientists have said, stop burning fossil fuels. You are cooking the planet. It's going to kill you. Oh, I hear what you're saying. Let's project a path to 2050 or 2070 or whatever. Let's promise that a future government will do something about it. So, yeah, it's extreme at the moment to suggest that we could ban things. That, of course, was what Bob Hawke thought when he called for a global ban on mining in Antarctica, extremist that he was. So, or John Howard introducing a ban on automatic weapons. What an extremist he was. So, yeah, at the time when so much power is consolidated around, the continuation of a harm, it's easy to depict people calling for change to be extremists, but it's pretty rare to hear. Nelson Mandela referred to as an extremist in hindsight. Why was he trying to end apartheid? Why didn't he just want to phase it out? Or the abolitionists of human slavery. No, there's still human trafficking taking place. Modern slavery exists, but was Wilberforce and the other people trying to end the slave trade between, England and the Caribbean and the US? Were they extremists, or were they people making a principled position saying, no, I want this to stop? So, it's extreme at the moment to listen to the science. It's extreme at the moment to listen to the public and say, why don't we stop doing so much harm? But yeah, history remembers extremists pretty well.
And speaking of extreme, Orcus is the biggest sovereign transfer of wealth in Australian history. And this is a policy that has come into place without parliamentary scrutiny. How is this a sensible centrist plan for Australia's future?
Well, because if the sensible centre is something that there's bipartisan consensus on, Orcus is as sensible as it gets. Put another way, you couldn't get a clearer example of why centrism's a crap idea than Orcus is centrist. All right, because the major political parties, and indeed most of the media in Australia, think it's the best idea we've got. And indeed, when Malcolm Turnbull organised an event over at the National Press Club about Orcus a couple of months ago, that myself and Emma Shortis and, it's a room full of people kind of interested in this stuff. The whole premise of Malcolm's thing was basically, all right, so what if Orcus doesn't work? What's plan B? If we really do need to have submarines, and the Orcus submarine contract with the US has a clause in it that says there's no promise you're getting a submarine. Right? This is not the fine print. We've already started paying for subs that the US has no contractual obligation to give to us. I don't know if you know this, right? But literally, we're paying already. We're paying to help the US build more subs so that the US can have more subs, so that one day the US has got enough subs that a future US president might feel that they've got enough subs that they'll sell some to us. So we're literally paying them now to solve their lack of subs problem in the hope that they're so good at solving their lack of subs problem that they'll have spare subs that they might sell to us. They are under no contractual obligation and there is no refunds for us. So when Malcolm Turnbull puts on an event and says, maybe we should talk about plan B, what happens if a future US president says, nah, sorry, can't do it? Pretty much everyone speaking on behalf of the defence establishment, the public service, no one from the government was there, said, well, there is no plan B. There is no plan B. We just have to make it work. It's like, it's literally up to the US president. How can you make it work? So, this is kind of the danger of bipartisanship. This is the danger of centrism, that we've been trained to believe that when both so-called parties of government support something, it's unarguably sensible, when actually sometimes it's explicitly stupid. And, to give you a sense of how this great sensible centre idea of Orcus came about, as Alice said, there was scant evidence put together for this. There's been no parliamentary inquiry. To be clear, it didn't go to Treasury or DFAT. Our Pacific neighbours often read about it in the newspapers. And what we found out recently was there wasn't even a cabinet submission. $360 billion massive change in defence and foreign policy was discussed by cabinet, but it was just the vibe that was discussed, not the substance. And then, of course, that was the Morrison government. The Labor opposition agreed to the idea within 24 hours of hearing about it. Sensible centre. So, this is the way language, has kind of ruined public debate. The fact that Malcolm Turnbull's just trying to say, all right, I think it's a bad idea, but can we talk about what happens if it doesn't work? No, we can't. Similarly, we can't talk about, so many things, including why we're still approving gas and coal mines in the middle of a climate disaster. It's up to us in a democracy to stop taking these debates as seriously as the media projects them. And it's perfectly okay for us to gather in rooms this size or any size to talk about things that don't fit between the major parties. And to come back to a theme I made before, that's why I think the independent and minor party vote's growing. Not because the individuals involved in the parties are stupid or evil, but because the control over what we're allowed to talk about is just leaving more and more people cold.
So this week, all over the news has been the government's economic reform roundtable. And when we're projecting forward and imagining what this government might do, what they could do, what kinds of options do they have? And what's your read on the roundtable?
What a great opportunity to dust off shit ideas from the last 30 years and try them again. Let's try and cut the company tax rate again. Let's reintroduce parts of work choice. I'm not kidding. This is what the Australian business community has kind of brought to the so-called productivity roundtable. You know, go back to the coalition era on industrial relations, cut the company tax rate, or Alice's favourite, what if we make all authors give their intellectual property to foreign tech companies to train their AI algorithms? Did anyone hear this idea? So the Productivity Commission, the so-called bastion of, you know, free markets, the once proud defenders of private property rights, are the ones saying we should force authors to give away their intellectual property for free in some charitable act to improve the training of some foreign AI algorithm. So, yeah, unfortunately, look, I'm glad they're having a roundtable. I'm glad they're having a chat about things. I'm glad that not all the voices in the room are as stuck in the past and moronic as that. But still, the debate is incredibly narrow. Australia is one of the lowest tax countries in the world, according to the pinko lefties at the OECD and IMF and World Bank. All this data is hidden on a top secret thing called their websites. What it shows is we're one of the lowest tax countries in the world. And we know we're having a productivity crisis. We know we are. And we know it's because government's too big. And we know it's because we're spending too much money on people. And we know we have to cut taxes. And we know we have to cut spending. It's just those same pinko lefties at those organizations also have data on productivity growth in other countries. Now, has anyone here heard of a country called Sweden? So it does exist, right? It's a thing. The public sector, government activity accounts for more than half of GDP in Sweden. Okay, more than half of their activity. We love our private schools and our private health insurance and our private transport and our privatized services. Well, the Swedes, you know, crazy that they are, still think that paying tax and funding those things through the government's a good idea. Sweden's productivity growth is double Australia's for the last 25 years. Double. So the Nordic, and it's not just Sweden, that's just the best example. See, Alice warned you at the start. So we're having a productivity roundtable where it is not just heresy, it is unspeakable to say, what if our taxes are too low? What if our public sector is too small? What if all the fake competition between job service providers is wasteful, expensive, busy work? No, that's crazy. Because this roundtable is run by the people who led the privatisation, who led the deregulation, who led the tax cuts. Oh, good, Ken Henry's back for another go. Great. You know, so the people who've spent decades saying if only we can cut spending and if only we can cut tax, things will get better. Literally, from the time that the Productivity Commission was formed, productivity growth has slowed in Australia. This is not top secret information. But who gets gathered into the room to have a round table about productivity? The people who fucked it up. And are we allowed to talk about the countries that are doing heaps better than us? No. So, yeah, I'm glad they're having a round table. I'm glad they're having a chat. I'm really excited that the ACTU has proposed a 25% tax on all revenues from gas exports. That's a great idea. Who'd heard of it before I just told you? Sally McManus announced it at the same time that she said maybe we need to rein in tax concessions for negative gearing and capital gains. That got splashed across the front pages. That made the news. But the fact that the ACTU said, what if we stopped subsidising the diesel fuel rebate for the mining industry, 14 billion a year in savings, and what if we stopped giving gas away for free, literally didn't get a mention in those centrist newspapers. Didn't get a mention. And those countries like Norway that I just said have got a bigger public sector and much better healthcare, much better education systems than us, guess what? They tax their fossil fuel industry. But those ideas don't fit in the sensible centre And even in a round table where there's a big ding-dong fight between bosses and employers and unions, and when the ACTU says, what about we tax gas, literally doesn't make the papers.
This is my last question before I open up to questions from the audience, if you'd like to start lining up at the microphone here. So,
right in the centre of the room, I should point out.
If we're looking to the future and what kinds of legislative changes this government can make, do they need bipartisan support? Can you point to the part of the Constitution which says that in order to guarantee longevity for legislative change in this country, we need bipartisan agreement? Can you find that for me?
No, I can't, because it doesn't exist. So history tells us that prime ministers that want to get things done, and part of getting things done is negotiation and compromise. I'm not opposed to negotiation and compromise. My critique of centrism is the rhetorical use of centrism to avoid actual compromise, to avoid solving complicated problems. So yeah, let's run through some examples. John Howard, when he was Prime Minister, wanted to introduce work choices. He could approach Labor and say, I won't do work choices until there's bipartisan consensus, because I want this to be lasting reform. Or B, sneak it through as quick as he can by one vote. Guess what John Howard did? Went with option B. When John Howard couldn't privatise Telstra because he didn't have the numbers for it in the Senate, some of you may remember that what he did was bribe Mal Colston to quit the Labor Party, sit as an independent, promoted him to be deputy president of the Senate, and then Mal voted to support the sale of Telstra. I don't know if you've noticed, but Telstra is still privatised. Lasting reform achieved not just by one vote, but one vote he bribed to get across the Senate floor. And of course, in Labor's first term, they wanted to get industrial relations reforms through, in part to unwind some of John Howard's work choices. And when Labor, this is really important, when Labor was serious about the issue, because they really wanted to get IR reform through, they didn't for a minute say, oh, I better see if I can talk the Libs into this. They didn't say, hey, Libs, you've got a veto over whether we can wind back work choices or not. They approached the Greens, and the Greens said, only if you toughen up the legislation. And Labor said, sold. And the IR reforms passed through the Senate with stronger protections than Labor even introduced. So, yeah, when a Prime Minister wants to get stuff done, they get stuff done. And when a Prime Minister doesn't want to get stuff done, they blame everybody else for why they can't do it. So, yeah, if you want to drive lasting reform, get it through the Senate, get it through both houses of Parliament, I should say, and make sure it's so popular that, like Medicare, if anyone tries to rip it up, thanks, Gough, if anyone tries to rip it up, they'll be unable to win elections. So, yeah, Labor can get anything that it and the Greens agree want done this term. Labor can get anything it and the Liberals want done this term. And on every bill that passes the House, it's up to the Prime Minister to say, all right, do I want to get this through with Green support? Might have to toughen it up in some sense. Do I want to get it through with Liberal support? Might have to water it down like they did getting public hearings out of the NAC. Or is this just a bluff bill? Am I just taking the piss? Am I just here trying to look like I'm governing, knowing that should keep people off my back, but I won't actually pick a fight with power? So yeah, what can Labor get done this term of office? Anything that it and a majority of the Senate can agree to. And Labor plus the Greens in the Senate is a majority. Should be an exciting progressive 3 years. Fingers crossed.
Just a reminder, questions should be short and sharpened questions. I'm sure we'll have a few that we'll be able to get through in the time. Thank you.
Hi. Given that Robodebt has already proven that just because something is illegal doesn't mean that the government can't do it, where do you think the role is for civil disobedience and non-violent direct action in getting the public conversation going about the things that we care about?
Look, great question. Yeah, so unfortunately, governments break the law sometimes, and we can see in America that it's really just culture that holds people back. I don't think we're anything near as bad as the US, but yeah, there's no doubt that senior public servants and ministers either knowingly broke the law or were so indifferent as to their legal obligations, went out of their way to not know they were breaking the law, and that happened for years, and no one's yet to go to jail for it. So, of course, civil disobedience is appropriate in circumstances, not just like that, but in all sorts of circumstances where people feel that that they're not being listened to. And indeed, I think that we should know that governments and indeed others with power, particularly corporations, understand how powerful civil disobedience and protest is, because otherwise they wouldn't try so hard to stop it. This is really important. Like, you know, when people protest in Australia, like, I don't know, was it 1,000 or 2,000 people that walked across the bridge recently? I know it wasn't many, right? It was a really small number of people, often carrying dummies to make the audience look the crowd look twice as big. And then soon after, when the government changes its position on recognising Palestine, everyone was adamant it had nothing to do with the protest. Nothing to do with the protest. Just like Sally McManus's comments about gas didn't get any media, the analysis about, you know, why the government's position had changed so quickly left out the obvious bit. So we know that protest works because they try so hard to stop it. We know that protest works because they try so hard to ban it. When climate activists protested down in South Australia at a gas conference 2 years ago, the South Australian government changed the law, the anti-protest laws, within 24 hours to make a maximum penalty for a protest at $50,000. Within 24 hours. Now, if they didn't think protest made any difference, why would they do that? If they weren't scared of it, why would they do that? So yeah, I think protest is really important in a democracy, and civil disobedience is really important in a democracy. And you know, this is not a new idea. It's not a uniquely Australian idea. It's only in recent years it's even been suggested that it might not be. So I see you've got your Rising Tide shirt on. Strength to your arm. Might see you up in Newey.
See you there.
Thanks. How about a round of applause for Rising Tide?
Richard, James, I really need your help because I'm quite discombobulated about what has been going on in Tasmania. Now, what is left and right and centre this week in Tasmania when all the left-leaning crossbench and the Greens have just voted to keep the Liberals in power? The Labor has described the Greens as the enemy of the people. It's just being turned on the head. So, and of course, the Liberals are going to ban greyhound racing. They're going to wind back a lot of the old growth forestry. They're going to have an independent commission on the salmon industry. Everything that supposedly the left side of politics would be working on, but it's the Liberals who are doing it. Please explain.
Well, I can't explain Tasmanian politics. I think it's inexplicable. But I'll have a go at giving you a framework for trying to figure it out for yourself. And the kind of recurrent metaphor in my essay is that a bad map is worse than no map at all. And the map that we have of our politics, our left, right, centre map, is actually disorienting us, right? It's like, you know, when you read those stories of someone's following their Google Maps and they drove into a fucking dam or something because they're staring at their map, not actually looking at the world they're in. So our political map of left, centre and right just doesn't make much sense anymore. Okay, the idea that climate change is a left-wing issue, I just can't get my head around that for all sorts of reasons, including that. Has anyone here heard of Angela Merkel? Yeah, you know, she was from the right, Okay, right, and by the way, Margaret Thatcher was worried about climate change. So the idea that things fit neatly into left and right and centre makes no sense for so many of the modern issues we face. And because of that, our public debates don't make any sense, because once one side arbitrarily adopts a position, the other side has to adopt the opposite position, even if it discombobulates people even further. So to be clear, the whole left, right, centre map is broken, and that's kind of why I think we need to stop thinking like that and stop using that language of sensible centre and extremes. But in terms of Tasmania, look, it's fascinating. Anyone here from Canberra? We know here in Canberra that in the lead up to every election, the Libs say, "I'll never do a deal with the Greens," and everyone's like, "Okay, then." Go be irrelevant. Okay, then they're not going to win a majority. They said they won't sort of share power with anyone else. So guess what? They'll never be in government. That's fine. I don't mind. That's their choice. Well, Labor, that's Labor in Tasmania, right? Labor are not going to win a majority in Tasmania in their own right. And for all sorts of reasons that I'll discuss briefly, they think the Greens are their enemy. So they're not going to go into a power sharing arrangement with a party that they're bleeding votes to. So I think the simple answer to what's going on in Tasmania is the Liberals are desperate to be in power and Labor is happy to be in opposition. No, it's what's happened, right? I don't know how closely any of everyone's followed, but this is the third time the same Labor leader, Dean Winter, this is the third time he said, "I don't want to be Premier." Okay, so we've just had an election down there. They had an election a year and a bit ago. After the election a year and a bit ago, Labor and the Greens could have formed government, and Labor said, no, don't want to do that, would rather be in opposition. Then they moved a no confidence motion from opposition. They moved a no confidence motion that was successful. And the governor said, "All right, Labor, do you want to form a government?" And they went, "No." And the governor said, "All right, I guess we'll have to have an election again." So I've had another election which has delivered pretty much the same outcome. And Labor's like, no, I'm not touching that power thing. No way. So only the impotent are pure. So Labor, they love to say that. Well, in Tasmania, they are as pure as Tasmanian spring water, because they don't want to cut deals with the Greens or independents or anyone else to share power, and they don't have enough votes to get in themselves. The Liberals are desperate to be in power. And it turns out their values of, being cruel to dogs and subsidising native forest logging aren't really values at all. They're just things they do when they have power in their own right. But if they have to share power to be in office, they're willing to stop doing some nasty things. So watch this space. I don't think it'll be a stable government, but it seems like the same Labor leader who 3 times has said he'd rather be in opposition than in government, sounds like until they change leader, they're not going to. They have today. Oh, how about that? I was writing a piece for the Saturday paper. All right, we'll take that last bit back. Who knows? Might only take a week and we'll get somewhere. But by the way, remember, this is really important. What we do is elect parliamentarians. You might think you voted for a party, you didn't. You elected a parliamentarian. And it's up to those parliamentarians to sort their shit out. And it's up to them to actually, form parties if they want, form governments if they want. But it's just a whole bunch of humans that have to do that. And if some of the humans are like, "I won't talk to them," well, then, not as much happens. So, happy days. Well, maybe we'll see some progress down there.
Cool. Yeah, a good segue there. So if all the solutions are obvious, they're hidden on websites, as you say, and we have and the main vectors for centrism, no one's reading them anymore, and there's a record low number of first preference votes for the majors, why, in your view, did the electorate overwhelmingly prefer more Labor? Is the system working and people want what we've got, or is the system broken and we have a crisis of critical thinking, or a combination of the two?
Yeah, okay, that's a short but big question. Look, I think the main thing that happened at the last election was Peter Dutton. All right, that's what happened. And if you want to look at the polls, effectively, all the undecideds had an election campaign, looked at Peter Dutton and decided. No, that's kind of what happened. All right, all of the undecideds at the beginning of the campaign usually get allocated 50-50, 60-40. All the pollsters have got their own way for allocating the undecideds. Well, the undecideds decided, and they fled the Liberals in droves. The consequence of that was that the Liberals lost even more seats, but they didn't flee the Liberals in droves to vote Labor. They fled the Liberals in droves to vote Independent, Minor Party, and only a small swing to Labor. So that's fine. It's still a legitimate win. When you say, is it the system? Well, different systems generate different results. We have proportional representation here in the ACT. We don't have proportional representation in federal elections. So, and in the UK, where they've got first past the post no preferences, if Jeremy Corbyn runs and takes 10% of the vote, Labor's going to get wiped out off a swing. Whereas in Australia, if 10% of your primary vote left, a lot of it would go back to the party that they left as a second preference. So you get to register your preference, you get to register your protest, and the stakes of doing so aren't nearly so high as they are in the US or the UK. So I don't think our system's broken. I think Labor didn't attract many primary votes, but the Liberals attracted far less primary votes. And a lot of the people who voted Independent and a lot of the people who voted Minor Party, having decided they didn't want to vote Labor and didn't want to vote Liberal, did what preferential voting allowed and went, all right, well, I want to vote for an Independent and maybe I want to vote for a Minor Party, and I think I might put Labor second last and the Liberals last. And in Australia, that really matters. Who you put second last really matters. And who you put last really matters. So I don't think it's illegitimate that preferential system delivered Labor lots and lots of seats. But what I would say is in 2019, when the Liberals lost Warringah, when Tony Abbott lost his seat to Zali Steggall, that was I know, what a terrible night that was. But that was a big shot across the Liberals' bows. This far-right crazy talk stuff can cost you some of your safer seats. Peter Dutton, so that's Tony Abbott as leader. Morrison comes in and says, hold my beer, spends 3 years pissing off that same cohort of voters, and they lose 6 seats in 2022. And then in 2025, won one of them back and lost another one. My point is, Labor won lots of seats in 2025, but it nearly lost Bean, it nearly lost Fremantle, it nearly lost Colwell. It's got a lot of very marginal seats now. It can say, oh, people love us, look how many seats we've got. Or it can say, whew, might have dodged a bullet there. Maybe I might listen a little bit harder, not to what the mainstream media is telling me is centrist, but what the people who used to give me a first preference, who are now giving me a fifth preference, I might want to think about them. Because what happens in our electoral system now is that independents who can basically get over 20% of the primary vote are well and truly in the hunt to win a seat, because a lot of Liberal voters really hate Labor and a lot of Labor voters really hate the Liberals. So anyway, big picture, if the reason people aren't reading newspapers anymore is they're not very interesting and they're not speaking to people. If political parties want to take their cues from the media with declining ratings, I think the major parties' primary votes will continue to fall.
We have time for one last question.
Awesome. Thanks for this discussion.
Oh, sorry. Come back. I'll answer them. Ask them both at the same time, and then I'll give concise answer to both.
Been very entertaining. So my question is maybe an alternative or a bit of a criticism of this theory that you're proposing, that vested interests in the major parties, sort of cause bipartisanship, which creates policy paralysis. My point really rests on sort of median voter theorem and the fact that maybe the two major parties are competing for a central cohort in the Australian electorate. And with a compulsory voting system, you see a lot of people turning out who support the centre ground, but might be a little bit more conservative. And we sort of see this in results of the referendum. So 32, 33 referenda, and only 8 of them have passed. 7 of them had bipartisan support. And so my question sort of relates to whether this policy paralysis is a result of pursuing sort of a median voter position that's sort of conservative and avoiding sort of change, or whether it really is vested interest in the major parties causing this paralysis.
My question's related to the issue of media. You've pointed out how people are fleeing the major parties because they're not talking about what they're interested in and turning to minor parties and independents, and that's a positive thing. We've seen that you have talked about how the same thing is happening with the media. People are leaving the mainstream media and turning to alternative media, and alternative media is quickly becoming the mainstream. Is alternative media as hopeful as the alternative minor parties and independents, or are we all going to end up in our own echo chambers?
All right, I'm going to try and answer both questions, but I'm going to combine them a little bit. So median voter theory is sort of the idea that, you know, if you picture you picture a beach, and you got people spread out all along the beach, and you've got the only ice cream truck on the beach. Where would you park your ice cream truck? In the middle, all right? Because that way you're maximizing the number of people that will come and think that it's worth the walk to get your ice cream. Now, say a second ice cream truck shows up on the beach. You might think the ice cream trucks would spread out, but they won't. Because if they kind of put themselves a third of the way along the beach each, they kind of divvy up the market half and half. Isn't that convenient? But one of the ice cream trucks will just move a little bit towards the centre, keeping all the ice cream buyers up here and picking up a few in the middle. And then the other ice cream truck just inches a little bit that way. And where do the ice cream trucks wind up? Right next to each other, right in the middle. So median voter theory says there's something inevitable about two major political parties being just like each other with small differences in the middle. And no, it's an interesting theory. I don't think it carries a lot of water in Australia, but the easiest way to kind of highlight the problems with it is, who says there can only be 2 ice cream trucks? That's kind of the problem, right? Who said there can only be a government, opposition, and everyone else's say doesn't really count? Why can't you have ice cream trucks all the way along the beach? Why can't you have people walking up and down the beach with a thing selling ice cream? Right? So the median voter theory takes for granted that there's only 2 parties, and it takes for granted that it doesn't matter how far away from your base you get, they'll always still come to you, and that a political party should always chase the middle and take the base for granted. And I don't think that's very democratic. I also don't think, around the world it's very successful. That's why most countries aren't 2-party systems. But also what we've seen with minor parties and independents is, if you get too far from your base, someone else will set up and sell ice cream to your base. I think diversity and choice is good in democracy. And then once we elect the people we want to our parliament, it's their job to do that power sharing that Dean Winter was struggling with, but his party's figured it out. So that's very good news. In terms of the role of new media, I think it's exciting. There's all sorts of problems with social media. I got off Twitter because it was horrible, and I put up with shit for a living, but it was just horrible. So I'm not saying there's no problems with social media. I'm not saying there's no problem with people being in their own echo chambers, but boy, I tell you what, there's also a problem when you got Murdoch-dominated media and a conservative ABC. A long time ago when I started out in this business, if you couldn't get a run in the Sydney Morning Herald, you couldn't get on the Channel 9 News, or you couldn't get on the ABC, you might as well not have an idea. And I tell you what, it's a lot easier these days to talk to a crowd, to find a constituency, to talk about things through all the incredible diversity of channels that are now available. So there's problems with it. There's absolutely problems with it. And echo chambers are a problem, but so is a Murdoch-dominated monopoly. And yeah, it's interesting watching people who in the media who were very happy to be silent about the influence of Rupert Murdoch, who were terrified about the influence of some blogger somewhere. So yeah, I think that it's a challenge for us. We're going to need to think harder about regulation. We're going to have to think harder about what the role of a public broadcaster is. Maybe we're going to need multiple public broadcasters. I know we've got SBS and ABC. I mean, more diverse than that. Maybe we don't want to have so much public broadcasterness concentrated in a few hands, because we've seen how off the rails that can go. The point is, this is going to be a permanent, evolving conversation. But I'd rather have choice and diversity than domination by a few things. Now, Alice will wrap me up, so I'll cut her off first and say, whenever I talk about things like this, especially about saying, look around, look how many people want to come and hear about different ways of thinking about politics. Someone usually asks the question, but Richard, aren't we just preaching to the converted? And there's nothing progressives love more than to feel guilty and inadequate, isn't it? Like, I know I've had a great night. I know it was fun. I know I learned something. I know I met someone, but we're just preaching to the converted. Well, you know what the church do every fucking Sunday? It's the best organising strategy in history. And to be clear, this isn't the only talk I'll give this week. This isn't the only audience the Australia Institute pulled together. And we're on commercial radio, we're on commercial TV, we do events all around the country. I'm off to my old hometown of Newcastle on the weekend to talk to similar people about similar things. But my point is, people coming together, people thinking for themselves, criticising other ideas, debating them. That's what democracy is built on. And just like we've been trained to think that protest is powerless, we've been trained to think that realising you're not alone in wanting something different is powerless. Well, I'd argue democracy tells us the exact opposite. Finding out that you're not alone with your values and your priorities is democratically essential, and standing up for it, whether it's at the ballot box or at a protest, is absolutely essential. So thanks for coming along tonight.
Thank you, Richard. And we've learned some of our strategies from these excellent organising operations. You'll find that we've got dead centre, buy one, get one free down the back. We'd love for you to give it to one of your friends or someone who disagrees with you. Spread the good word. Thank you so much to Verity Lane for hosting us. And thank you.
And I'm interrupting again. And that's the People's Blockade up in Newcastle. Flyers around. Check them out. Well done, Rising Tide. And also Nationwide March for Palestine, Canberra, Sunday, 12 p.m, Civic Square. So well done to people organising democracy.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Have a good night.
Thanks, Alice.